Welcome back to CETV. Today we're here with the fantastic Andrew J Clarke, Sony brand advocate, to talk to you about the latest from Sony. We can't quite tell you what it is yet. Come back soon and check it out. Welcome back to CETV. I'm Howard Frank from Camera Electronic, and today we've got Andrew J Clarke, fantastic photographer and Sony brand advocate. G'day, Andrew.
Hi Howard, how are you?
Yeah, well, mate. So we've got a new camera.
Brand new camera. Yep.
What is it?
So we got the A7R Mark V. Five. It's been in the works for a little while, and yeah, I was expecting the camera full stop, but I was expecting like an incremental upgrade from the R4 because there's been a few features that Sony's brought out over the last couple of cameras. But it isn't really an incremental upgrade. They've kind of gone all out.
So it's interesting, right? We all hear the rumours, we see the rumour sites if we've got time to read them, and everyone gets excited and anticipates what's going to come. I think this has actually delivered a lot more than what we anticipated.
Yeah, I think so. Like, one of the big things which I was expecting was a rework of the ergonomics.
Yep.
The button placement, all of those things, maybe an articulating screen, and the video features to be brought up to 2022 specs to keep in line with the A7 IV,
Yep.
the A1 and what the S3's done on video.
Sure.
What I wasn't really expecting was them to also rework the autofocus systems and to add in a bunch of like smaller features, which I think landscape photographers and other professionals have been asking for a long time. And then they've also gone, speaking of articulating screens, they've gone all out on a brand new 4-axis articulating screen design.
So we were talking about this earlier, and I was looking at it on a video with Sony the other day, but didn't actually see it in the flesh. This is something really special. Like, talk us through this screen a bit.
Yeah, it's kind of unique, and it's brand new for the Sony lineup. It won't just articulate in the way that we've seen articulating screens do recently on the S3 and on the 7 IV. It's also got the ability to tilt up and down when in this base position, like this and like this. So that means if you're doing things like using a cage or an L bracket for your landscape shooting and you want to shoot in portrait orientation, you can flip the screen down and around like this, sure, but you can also bring it away from the body if you need to clear accessories and cables.
That's really handy. I think even just sort of hand holding for video, like sort of having it like that as well could be pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can balance it however you want. A lot of videographers these days are using gimbals.
Yep.
And if you've got it out to the side, sometimes that can cause stabilization issues on gimbals, depends what you're using. But now you can keep it in line with the center of gravity of the camera by still having the screen behind the camera, but you don't lose that ability to tilt up and tilt down. And that's what you lost with the older design articulating screens. If you wanted to tilt it up, it had to be to the side.
Yeah, that's really handy, isn't it?
Yeah, super handy. The most functional screen that I've ever used.
That's amazing. So if we're excited about the screen,
Yep.
like what else? We're talking about bulb timer.
Yeah, so not only have they revamped the video specs and given us this screen, there's a couple of little things which I know I've been asking for a while as a landscape photographer, just quality of life things,
Yep.
which have been missing from the R series for a few generations. One of them being a bulb timer, so bulb where you start and stop your exposure yourself. You'd always have to use a remote, either a Sony branded Bluetooth remote, or the app could be used.
Yeah.
Now you can dial in the exact length of time before you hit the exposure. So if you put a really dark ND filter on the front, you want a 2-minute exposure, you can dial that in the camera menu and let it run. You don't need to babysit it.
So you showed me this shot you just took in Wellington, New Zealand.
Yes.
That would have been done with bulb timer.
Yeah, so this was a bulb timer. In this particular composition, I'm waiting for some cars to hit this S-bend in order to give me that feature in the foreground. And it was from the angle I was at, it was hard to see when the cars were going to emerge from one direction. So doing a much longer exposure increases the opportunity that I'm going to get a full length light trail.
Yeah,
so I was actually doing 1-minute exposures.
And did you have to play around with that a bit to get it exactly where you wanted?
Yeah, there's a little bit of technique. I knew I wanted it at least 20 seconds,
Yep,
which
sure.
I could have done without using bulb, but then there's a safety factor going a little bit longer and trying to get even multiple cars. It wasn't a particularly busy road, so I needed to lengthen the exposure a little bit to get it up to a full-length light track.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So what ISO are you at there?
So I shot this one at ISO 100.
Oh, wow.
Because I'm using such a long exposure, the camera does quite well in retaining detail in those shadows and not clipping in the highlights by using the base exposure.
But you've had a chance to play with low light capabilities and push the ISO a bit?
Yeah, so I'd say it's roughly the same as the R4.
Yep.
I still haven't been able to unlock the RAW files yet because it's a pre-production camera at time of filming. So I don't know if there's any substantial difference from the R4, but I was an R4 shooter, I have been for a long time, and it's perfectly capable low light camera. Perhaps not as specialized as the S3 or the 7.4 and those sorts of cameras, but you can see here it'll do well with shadows in your shot regardless.
Yeah, sure. And we're talking a bit about video. I know you've tried it a bit. I know you've got an A7S. I know you've got an FX series as well. Why would you use this for video if you've got those? Like, what's good about it?
Well, I think the first thing is like it's got the new codecs that Sony rolled out with the S3. So it'll do 10-bit video 422. It's the second camera Sony's put out which does 8K behind the A1. So it'll do 8K, I think up to 25. I'm not sure if it does 30 frames per second. I need to check that. But so not really slow-mo 8K.
But we can do slow-mo at 4K.
But we can do slow-mo at 4K.
That's still amazing.
Yeah, it's still very useful. I know from doing the odd corporate gig and the old wedding and whatever, going up to 60 frames per second is typically the sweet spot for slow-mo, like a little bit of slow-mo, but not crazy frame rates, is generally what pros use most of the time. And the 4K 120 is a bit more specialized. It's not a tool which I need all the time. So
could you use this as a B cam if you're using your A7S III to shoot a job?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you are a true hybrid shooter, you do a lot of video and a lot of stills, this probably shouldn't be your main video camera,
no, of course.
Although it's still excellent. And if you can only pick one, it'll be fine. But as a B camera, it'll match perfectly because it's got the same new codecs, 10-bit 422, and things like S-Cine tone, the gamma profiles, which will perfectly match with the other more film-centric cameras that Sony's put out recently.
Yeah, okay, that's really cool. And we were talking about all this stuff. So we were just talking earlier before we went on camera, and we said only 10 frames a second. Yeah. And then we were joking that a sports camera only a few years ago was 10 frames a second, and now this is such a high-res camera at 61 megapixel. Yeah. And we've still got 10 frames a second.
Exactly, and the good thing about that, and what they've done with the newer cameras as well, is we've got new card slots in here. So they're not brand new, these are the same 2-in-1 SD plus CF Express Type A card slots. So you put in a CF Type A card slot and all of a sudden your buffer is in the hundreds of RAW files. And so yes, 10 frames per second is not crazy fast these days, but you will not hit the buffer for hundreds of photos.
I could think of nothing worse than editing hundreds of photos.
Yeah, and 60 megapixel RAW files. But you can lower the image quality now as well in RAW. So you can shoot smaller resolution RAW files on this camera. They've got a low, medium and high preset. I haven't actually delved in to see exactly what they are, but I think it's around 26 megapixels for the medium preset on
Which
RAW.
is still very useful for most applications.
Yeah, so you can have a lossless RAW 26 megapixel file out of this. So if you are going to a shoot where you need to take thousands of photographs, where previously I have avoided using the R series cameras because of just the sheer amount of data, you now have the option to lower the image quality and still use this camera.
Yeah. So what do you do? I mean, 61 megapixels, it's big files, especially once we can use RAW with it. What are you doing storage-wise and all that sort of thing?
Myself, I've got a storage RAID array at home because I've just got so much media these days. But I would generally recommend people pick up like a solid state drive to work off.
And then when you're on location, like you've gone down to New Zealand for a week or whatever, you're not only going to take the 2 cards, I presume. Like, what are you going to do to work through that?
Well, you can get away with 2 cards if you've got reasonably high capacity on them, but then I back up every night. So I've got a little external solid state hard drive that I take with me, back up to that every night.
Sure.
So if I run out of card space, I can always format them because I've got that backup.
Yeah, cool. So the other really interesting upgrade feature with this, I thought, was the autofocus. So Sony's been absolutely amazing for some time now, as we know with the eye autofocus and the tracking and things like that. They were telling me that we can now track insects.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so they've brought out a whole range, and this is what I was saying at the start. I wasn't really expecting any big fundamental changes with this camera, but they have really reapproached autofocus, and they're pushing like the AI-driven subject detection. So it's not just insects. They've redone the way that birds and animals work, so they can be shot together, whereas previously you had to choose either
That's right. Yeah,
animal eye detection or bird eye detection. But there's also insects, cars, trains, planes as well. Yeah, so I took a couple of photos on my trip to New Zealand. Yeah, and so what was interesting about this, there was some seals and some seagulls. I was more interested in taking the seals, but because of this combined eye autofocus setting, it was easy for me to quickly spin around and get the bird taking off. And the eye detection for birds now is much, much better than the first.
And I mean, this is only the JPEG, and that eye's pin sharp.
It's right on the eye, and I could see it. I could see the little green dot around the eye as I was taking the shot, so I knew it had detected the eye.
That's amazing. What lens were you using for that?
That was just an 85 prime.
Wow.
Because I wasn't really there for wildlife. I was there to take the landscape shots. I'll show you a couple other landscape shots from this shoot. So this is down on the south coast of the North Island.
Yep.
Putting the camera to the test in more landscape situations. But again, because of these new autofocus settings, I was able to quickly spin around and do a bit of wildlife stuff, you know, at a touch of a button.
Yeah, that's cool. So the only thing is making sure you've got the right lens on to try. But even then, if you're too wide on this, with the 61 megapixels, you can crop in a fair bit and still get pretty good.
And there was a little bit of cropping in those photos, but still, you know, we're still talking about a 25, 30 megapixel file after the crop.
Yeah, that's good.
The one other thing which I noticed while I was out there doing this wildlife stuff is they've revamped the IBIS as well, so the in-body image stabilization.
So I believe they've quoted 8 stops.
8 stops, yeah. So Sony's been around the 5 or 5.5 stops since they sort of pioneered in-body image stabilization, I think with the 2nd generation cameras.
Sure.
So it's been roughly the same system, and it's sort of an upgrade has been overdue. I wasn't really expecting it in this camera, but it's in this camera. So yeah, 8 stops.
I would have expected that more in the S range rather than the R range.
Yeah, exactly. But it does become noticeable in those longer telephoto situations. So when I did a little bit of wildlife, even though it was only on an 85, I was really noticing how much more stable it was when framing up those shots. It's a noticeable improvement over the last generation.
Well, I know you're predominantly landscape, and certainly this is a camera that's very exciting for you, but I know a lot of animal photographers, wildlife photographers that are going to be really excited by this camera, because to be able to do 10 frames a second, pretty much limitless buffer burst rates, and do it at 60 megapixels with something like the 200 to 600, it's such a versatile camera.
Absolutely, and I recommended the R4 for a lot of wildlife people when the way they suited that camera because of that higher resolution, and it still had fantastic autofocus, still had the real-time tracking, but they've just leveled it up again. And this will be even better for wildlife shooters because way less buffer. You will not buffer nearly as much on this camera because of the new card slots, and then the revamped autofocus as well. It'll be quite a good wildlife camera. Yeah,
definitely. I agree 100%. So what else is going to make you want to run out and get this, especially as opposed to, Sony's got the A7 range, the R, the S, the 9, the 1, then of course FX. They've got a fantastic range. Why would you choose this one? I know you've got quite a few, like what levitates towards this?
So I think it is still, I think, pushed first and foremost for the landscape photographers, the people who are really after high image quality. Because you've got 61 megapixels, which is still class leading within that full frame range. You're not giving up any dynamic range for that. They're still quoting 15 stops of dynamic range, which is up there with all of the best in this category.
Absolutely.
And then all the softer features, which will suit landscape photographers, that articulating screen for when you do need to go vertical and those sorts of things, or getting down really low to the ground in cramped positions.
You've had it on the gimbal as well, you said?
Yeah, I had it on the gimbal just to do a bit of testing to make sure, test out the balance issues. So it will work for a bit of video stuff. If you're into time-lapse, it's got great time-lapse features. And then those few other new things, like the bulb timer, surprisingly, I will use that all the time. I do so much long exposure, and the ability to dial that in and then wander away from the camera and not, forget to end your exposure. That's a big deal. And then the other new little thing, which I wasn't necessarily expecting, was focus bracketing in camera. Yep. So again, for landscape photographers, if you're doing a really deep composition, you may need to focus bracket for your really close foreground, midground, and background. It's not just something which the macro photographers will love, but well, good for landscape as well.
I think macro and astro for that too, potentially.
Yeah, yeah. Integrated function for that in camera. You can set sort of like the time between each focus bracket, and it'll stack it for you.
Yeah. Oh, so many applications. And the EVF, good?
Yeah, EVF upgraded from the R4, so I think it's a 9.5 million dot EVF. So really bright, really detailed, definitely improvement over the last generation.
Awesome, awesome. Cool, well, guys, I think there's not much more to say about this. What a beast of a camera.
Yeah, big beast.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Andrew definitely wants to get the first one. So if anybody else wants to get more after that, they have to wait for Andrew, definitely.
Yeah.
And thanks very much, Andrew. It's been awesome having you along again.
No, thanks for having us.
And it's just so good to get you. I think we had about 3 hours in between plane trips. So we're very grateful that you could join us, that you had the chance to test it out. So guys, thanks very much. They'll be available for pre-order shortly. Don't forget, if you'd like to see more from us, or if you've got any comments, please leave them for us. Like and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube, CETV, or check out the website, cameraelectronic.com.au. Huge thanks again to Andrew J Clarke, and we'll see you guys next time.